I'm Bob, an alcoholic. Boy, I was just glancing, not really looking that deeply, but glancing at some of these questions. It just, boy, there's some really sick people here, I'll tell you. Yeah. I'm going to try, I'm not an answer guy, but if I have experience on something, I'll be glad to share it. And if it's helpful, great. If it's not, and if I share something that's in conflict with what your sponsor said, I think your sponsor's right. Okay. It says here, this question, you mentioned that some people in the rooms are not alcoholics. How does someone know for sure that it's alcoholism and not another health disorder? Well, there's two sides to that. The book says that we do not want to pronounce anyone alcoholic, and I think the reverse must be true. I don't want to pronounce you a non-alcoholic, and we do that, don't we? One of the worst things you can say about somebody in AA, probably not an alcoholic. And we're not supposed to do that. It's not our job to pronounce that you alcoholic or someone else. It's only our job to diagnose ourselves. And the book gives, one thing that it suggests to people who aren't sure if they're alcoholic on how they can diagnose themselves. And it says to step over the nearest bar room and try some controlled drinking. And the reason that it suggests that is because there's only one litmus test for alcoholism. And it's not your drug of choice. It's not how you feel when you're not drinking. It's not the frequency of your drinking. It's not the fact whether you black out or not. It's simply an allergic reaction to alcohol. And that occurs in people who will swear to you. They'll swear to you. They're not an alcoholic. My problem's heroin. Yet if they go out and have 3 drinks of alcohol, they're compelled to go get more stuff or drink more or something. They have an allergic reaction to the alcohol. That's the litmus test. And I can't diagnose you alcoholic or non-alcoholic. I may have my opinions, but I try to keep them to myself. I will never inflict them on an individual. We all know people in Alcoholics Anonymous. I sponsored a guy that was sober. He's sober 45 years. He was sober longer than I was. And the only reason he asked me when he was 35, 30-some years, 34 years sober, he asked me to sponsor him. He'd been 34 years and never worked the steps, never sponsored anybody, never did nothing except go to a meeting once in a while and not drink. And he asked me to sponsor him because he was having a bad time because his wife died. And he was in some grief. And he thought, well, maybe I should get a sponsor. And then once the grief went away, he didn't need me anymore because he is one of those people who has what you might suspect would be acute rather than chronic alcoholism. Now, there's acute illnesses and there's chronic illnesses, and there's a very big difference, and it's important to know what you are. But both of those positions can have the phenomenon of craving. The difference in the acute alcoholic is that if they drink, it sets them off, but if they stop drinking, they have in them the ability to stay stopped without working the steps, without a spiritual experience, without anything. They don't get like the chronic, like me. I stopped drinking, and I'm determined not to drink, and my life just gets really vacant and desolate and depressing until I can't think of anything else except the urgent need for relief. Some people aren't that way. Some people can have a lot of problems with alcohol, put the plug in the jug, and coming to AA is just, it's like the sober Elks or something, they reminds them that they're alcoholic. That's good. They could have put a little sign on the mirror, you're alcoholic. That would have probably done just as much. And it's a social thing for them. But they never need to do what chronic alcoholics do. But yet I believe if they have the physical allergy to alcohol, and I'll tell you why that's so important. We get people that come into Alcoholics Anonymous. I think this is potentially very dangerous to us who aren't alcoholics. I was down, I'm a little over 36 and a half years sober. So this was October, 6.5 years ago. It was right before my 30th AA birthday. I was doing a workshop in Tucson, Arizona. And I met this woman, was sitting there, and she came up and started talking to me, and she had a whole row of new women that she was sponsoring, whole row. And I applaud that. I think that's very cool. She comes up and shows me her 30-year chip. She just gotten it. I said, oh, that's really good. I said, well, October I think all the humble people get sober in October. I was kidding around with it, because I'm coming up at the end of the month, right? If I make it a couple more weeks, I'll get one of those. And it was fun. We, goofed around a little bit, and I started the workshop, and it was on the doctor's opinion. And she's sitting right there with her girls, and she comes up to me at the break, and she says to me, she's like very quiet. She says, I don't have that thing you were talking about. And I said, what thing? She said, I'm allergic to reaction to alcohol, that craving. And I know how this is. It uses your own mind against you. A lot of us had it and didn't realize that's what it was because we think we change our mind. Or maybe it's been so many years. As I said to her, well, it's been 30 years since you had a drink. You just don't remember that cause and effect. And then she goes like this. She goes, well, actually, I have a couple drinks once in a while. And I was shocked. And and she must have seen my expression on my face, but she goes, but I don't get drunk. I just have one glass of wine, maybe two. I don't get drunk. And I said, are you kidding me? She said, no. I said, did it feel weird to take a chip for 30 years when you know you have once or twice a year you have a glass of wine or two? She said, but I don't get drunk. And we talked. The more we talked, she never was alcoholic. And here's the mistake she made. Her husband was alcoholic. And she went to Al-Anon, but it was boring to her. And she came into AA and really liked AA. Well, it's a room full of her drug of choice. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Right. Right. Well, no, but here's, and this, I think this happens more than we realize. She identified with the emotions and the thinking, even though she's never, ever had a problem with alcohol and never will, because she doesn't have that thing, and concluded because she identified with the emotions and the thinking and the things she heard in the rooms that she must be alcoholic. Now, the frightening thing is I think she was encouraged to tell everybody the truth. Well, the first example and the first thing these new girls ever trusted in was her. What's going to happen to them? There's a guy in Vegas who stayed sober. Aaron knew him 5 years. Sponsored 4 guys, went back to drinking. He can drink. He's not an alcoholic. He had a little problem. He was in the nightclub business, did a little too much cocaine, got a little out of hand, came to AA, and he went back to drinking. And all his sponsees got to see him drink successfully, and he's been drinking successfully for a while now. He never was alcoholic. The one guy that he sponsored he'll probably going to die if he hasn't died already, because he cannot come back to AA, even though he ends up forced into these treatment centers. He hates AA because he can't trust it. He'll never trust it again. That's why singleness of purpose and being an alcoholic is important, and that you get this through sponsorship. Sponsors should walk you through the process in the beginning of identification and qualifying you. If you follow working with others, that's what they do. Not so that the sponsor can diagnose you or not, so that you can diagnose yourself. Right? So you can diagnose yourself. So you can say to yourself, well, I like AA and I identify a lot of stuff here, but the truth is I could actually have 2 drinks regularly and never, not have any problem. Well, come to open meetings, you're welcome, but let's find a fellowship that might really be of what you're here. Don't come here, don't be the ugly duckling in the group of swans. Go find your group of swans, right? And so I think it's important. I would hate to see we open the doors wide enough here. What would happen 20 years from now if 50% of our fellowship can drink successfully? Maybe some of them do. They just don't. They don't want to say anything because there's some fanatical people in AA that don't understand how I can have a glass of. So don't say anything. I'll tell you something. That would make AA very unsafe for me because then I couldn't trust what I see and hear here. And my life was saved because I made connections with that I could start to trust. That the people here, I'm really sick and I'm decrepit and I got a lot of problems. But my God, we all got this same thing. You're dying of this too, aren't you? You can't stop drinking when you start. And I think that's very important, very important. At any given point in time, how do you know what God's will is in your life? Well, I know what it's not pretty clearly. It's a great question. I remember just constantly anguishing over God's will. And here's what I did. I went to enough meetings that I would hear the miracle stories. You'd hear some guy say, and I was lost, and I didn't know, I couldn't get a job, and I didn't know what I should do for a living. And so I just told God, I will do anything you want me to do, and I surrendered to God my employment situation. And now I'm the president of the United States Steel. And I go, whoa. So I want to find God's will because I'll get a bigger piece of the pie, right? I heard enough miracle stories here that tweaked my ego. And then, you wear that out after a while. And what happened, I started to get a vision of God's will. In chapter 5, it says, when we're afraid, and usually when I'm desperate for God's will, it's usually because I'm afraid. When I'm afraid, we ask God to remove our fear and turn our attention to what He'd have us be. What does a person aligned with God look like? What would they look like in this situation you're in work, Bob? How would one of those guys act there? Evidently not like you're acting. How would he act? How would he conduct himself there? How would a guy who is one with God conduct himself in his sex life? Evidently a lot better than you're doing, Bob. What's that look like? And then try to be that guy. And there's certain things that are over the test of time becomes apparent with God's will. One of the things, God's will never feels like you're jamming a square peg into a round hole. That's willful, right? Any vision of God's will that only serves you is probably not a vision of God's will. It's that ability we have to delude ourselves. And one of the things it talks about in step 11 is this egotistical presumption that we know God's will. And it warns us, if we presume to be inspired at all times, we're going to pay for that presumption in all sorts of absurd actions and ideas. Oh, unbelievable. One of my favorite things with the guys I sponsor is when they come to me, as I went to my sponsor in my second year of sobriety, and I said to him, he was telling me about I started dating this girl. He told me to stay away from her. He'd never been the arbiter of my sex conduct, but in this particular one case in all those years, he said, you need to stay away from her. She's sick. And I said to him, Dick, we're all sick here. He gets this look on his face like, I think there's going to be some entertainment value here. And I said to him, she's God's will for me. And he goes, he says, why do you say that? I said, listen to me. Listen. I drank Richard's Wild Irish Rose. She drank Richard's Wild Irish Rose. Whoa! Now, what am I doing? Am I trying to align my will with God's, or am I trying to delusionally imagine God's come to his senses and has aligned his will with me? Right? So any vision of God's will that only seems to be good for you is probably not a vision of God's will. God's will always seems to be the greater path of love and caring, but not in a codependent way. God's will can be at times very abrupt. God's will can be very pointed, but it's never harsh and it's never hurtful. You want to know what God's will is? Take Corinthians. Take the word love out and put God's will in, and you'll see a vision of God's will that's pretty amazing. The part they read at weddings about love. What is your purpose of amends when to do so would injure them or others? How do you free yourself of that guilt and bondage? Well, I think freeing yourself of guilt is a byproduct, but that's not what we're doing. If you're looking for the results, you're one of those people that are trying to work the promises and hope the steps come true. What really amends are about, it's about the other person. Well, there's a rule, there's several rules in the book. And on the first one is on page 74, and it says the rule is we're always to be hard on ourselves, but always considerate of others. Amends really is the ultimate arena of self-sacrifice, because it's not about you, it's about them. It's really, it goes back to that old spiritual positioning of God first, you second, me last. Me last. It's what's best for them. How can I make this better? Now, reducing the separation between you and that person is great, and that's a byproduct, but it's really, you're doing this for them. You're not doing it for you. You're doing it to help them. You've hurt them now, and you're trying to mend the harm you've done. Some amends have to be made from the flank. Some amends involve sending money to people that have already told you they won't take it, and being surprised that they cash your check. Sometimes amends really can't be made because sometimes people have died, or people just will not. They'll just stonewall you, and you can't get to see them. They have layers of executive secretaries and things. You can't get to them. When it's someone that can't be seen, the book says, so we write them an honest letter. Other times, when there just is no wherever, it's not possible. If you can't pay it back, then I think spiritually I feel compelled to pay it forward. I've over the years, I've never been able to make all my amends. There's some people I've never found. I heard a lot of nameless, faceless people, and the chances of me ever finding them are almost nil. I mean, anything's possible. And I've looked for everyone I could find. I can tell you, in all honesty, today, I've made amends to everyone where it was possible, where I could find them, regardless of the fear. The willingness eventually came. The change of heart eventually came. I started trusting God. Eventually, more than I believed in my fears of facing that person, and all those people that where it was possible have been made. But I have a whole bunch of people I've never made amends to. I can't find them. And so I know, I owe. I know. So I pay it forward. I help guys. I throw a little extra money in the basket sometimes. If I run into a guy in AA's new and the transmission went out on his car and he has to have his car running because he just got a job and he's so scared, I'll put out the $500 or whatever I'll pay it forward to help that guy get his car fixed. Because I owe. And he didn't ask me. I just know I owe. If he'd asked me, I might not have done it. But I saw the opportunity, and I responded to it. And I think we do a lot of that stuff. There's an argument in AA. Is that step 10, is that step 9 or is that step 12? Who cares? Just do it, right? Just do it. We live a life of service. We live a life of redemption, retribution. You know, we try to get even. Anyway, you talk and use the big book like it is a sacred text. And actually, when I got here, I talked and used my head like it was a sacred text. And don't get me wrong, it has changed my life. I bet on how am I supposed to believe that it was written by Bill and others so perfectly that not only hasn't it been changed, but that it has been used to change the lives of millions. Am I just supposed to accept that God wrote the book through Bill, and how do I avoid becoming a big book thumper? If you keep thumping that book, you'll go blind. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. You know, you never talk down to an alcoholic. I think sometimes there's a phase that we go through, and it turns people off, and it's referred to as big book thumping, etc. I mean, born-again Christians go through that, don't they? I mean, usually they grow spiritually enough that they become really great people, but there's a phase that they go through. It's like you don't want to be around them. Self-righteous. The problem with self-righteousness is self. And if anyone was ever more, I don't think there's anybody on the planet that's been ever more sensitive to self and self-righteousness than the self-righteous. And so when I get guys I sponsor, you know, they first get into the big book. It's like they found the secret that nobody knows about in AA. And, you know, they want to tell us all, right? Well, that's cool. I don't rain on their parade because I trust that they'll eventually mellow out, because it's not useful to be to be that way. Self-righteousness is not useful. It actually pushes the people away that you really might have a chance to help. And so I don't rain on their parade. I think if you're doing something that's good and you're doing it obsessively, well, you're still doing something good. My hope is that you just mellow out in time, right? I think this is just me. I believe that I don't know about the whole book, but I know that there are sections of this book that had to have been divinely inspired. Wilson was incapable of writing them. There's a letter that Bill wrote where he's trying to describe how he wrote what I've come to believe is the most amazing part of the book, and that's from page 60 through the end of the chapter, and which encompasses this amazing insight into us and why we need step 3 of the selfishness, the self-centeredness, and then the resentment inventory. And this was our course, and how you have to make that shift in consciousness. Bill says he got up to the beginning of chapter 5, and he was stuck. He had what some people might call writer's block. He just was blocked. He was stuck. And so he prayed and he meditated, and he said, and this thing when you think about what he says here, and I believe that what he says, he was trying to be honest. He said that he picked up the pen and it moved across the page as if it had a life of its own. That is a description of automatic writing. That's when something, certain people believe that something is channeling through you. And that has to be true, because Bill wrote about things in that section of the book that were beyond his experience. And stuff that 80 years, 75 years later proves to be absolute effective with people that Bill with personality types that have alcoholism that Bill had never encountered. Right? there's a theory that in every generation or so that there are individuals that come into consciousness on the planet that bring something with them from the other side. And these people seem to be able to make leaps in thinking that are beyond logic, because they bypass all the middle stages to get there. It's an intuitive leap. Einstein, I believe, was one of those guys. I think Carl Jung at times was. And I think Bill Wilson was. I think Buddha was. I think there's been a lot of people like that throughout history. I think Wilson was one of those guys. And the proof is in the pudding, is that there's more sober people in the world today as a result of this book than the accumulation of all methods of treatment throughout history combined. And not just by a little bit, by many, many percent, by many, many times. So something entered the world through this book, and Bill Wilson wasn't smart enough to write it, I don't think. I think he was an instrument. That's my view. I could be wrong, but I'll tell you something, saved my life. And I had a guy one time say to me, I love newcomers that like to argue about AA. And it's one of the reasons I like Aaron so much. I had this one guy, and he was a very smart guy. He had several degrees, a doctorate degree, very bright guy. I told him at one point that thing Father Martin says about thermometers have degrees, where they shove them sometimes, don't you? He didn't think that was funny. But he calls me out after a meeting, and he says, "Are you open-minded?" I said, "Well, I hope so. I try to be, I guess." He said, "Are you willing to entertain the possibility that there really isn't this divine hand here, this God, that all it is it's a series of coincidences and a series of things that you've done, and your recovery is actually your doing. You've just deluded yourself into thinking it's God. You're willing to entertain that possibility?" I don't know. I thought, well, nobody had ever asked me that before. I thought, well, I guess it. I said, I guess it's possible, I suppose. Maybe when I die, I'll find out that it was all a delusion, that my whole life was built on a delusion. And then I said, well, let's go. And we walked over to my Jaguar, and I was getting him a ride back to the halfway house. And and we're in the car, and we're driving back to the halfway house, and I said to him, you know something? Even if you're right, I'll take it, because it's the best life I've ever had. Rather than go back and stand on that bridge in the filth and urine-soaked clothes, trying to get up enough courage to kill myself. I'll take the delusion, even if that's what it is. I will. Best life I've ever had. What are your thoughts on smoking weed for anxiety while in the program? It takes meditation to a new level. I think it's dangerous. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I tried to smoke marijuana for anxiety, and I kept going back to drinking. And you know something? Even if I wouldn't have, and I would have found a way to stay free from alcohol, smoke, and pot, I think it would have been the greatest self-shortchanging I've ever committed on myself in my life. Because when you don't know this when you're stoned, but you're blocked. You're blocked. I think the same thing is true of a lot. I know people that are on medication, and they stay sober for a long time, but and maybe they have to have it. I don't know. I'm not a doctor, and I won't tell anybody to take stuff, and I won't tell anybody not to take stuff. But I often suspect that there's a disconnect there. Now, it doesn't mean they're not sober, but there's a disconnect. It's almost as if your spirit has to be raw in order to get closer to God. It has to be in that state you don't like it to be in. You have to be sometimes uncomfortable to grow spiritually. Sandy Beach used to tell a story that, he was a pilot, and he said in the old days, when you were flying a plane, you had these headphones on, and you would fly and land planes in bad weather where you can't see the runway. And the way you did that in the old days is that if you get on what they called the beam, and when you're on the beam, the sound in the headlights was like mellow, just nothing. If you got off to the left too far, as you started moving off the beam to the left, you'd get this increasingly annoying wow, 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 wow. And you get off to the right a little bit, you get nya, 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 nya. You get up a little bit, and it was irritating. So it'd bring you back till you wanted the peace. And he said that he said that he believed when you take anything that numbs you on the inside, it's like taking the headphones off. Now you don't have the irritant anymore, but you're going to probably land the plane in the mall, right? Because there's that God, and his point being is that God will direct you and move you and push you into change through the discomfort of your emotions. Matter of fact, what else is he going to work with? I think depression's the way that God grinds away our egos to surrender. I think anxiety is the way we're moved into letting go. I think without that stuff, I would never see. And I come here, and believe me, I did psychiatrist and all that stuff for a number of years, and I liked it because it gave me relief. But I never changed. I never grew. But it gave me relief. And self-obsessed, selfish, self-centered people like myself, I'm a relief junkie, man. That's all I want. Change? I don't want change. I want to feel better. I want to feel better. I don't want to change. I don't want to grow. I want to feel better. I'm self-serving. And I have some dear friends that pursue some of these things. They seem to be stuck. They don't get worse, but they don't get better. I'm a scuba diver. And those of us that dive, we start to inadvertently learn stuff about marine biology. It's just part of the deal. And there's this type of shark that God has created in such a manner that it has to keep moving forward, because if it can't stop, it can't lay on the bottom of the ocean like a lot of fish and sleep. It cannot do it, because it has to have water continually flowing over its gills, or else it suffocates. So those sharks go out into the deep blue and have involuntary tail action just to keep them moving while they sleep. They move while they sleep. I think I'm like that. I think what happens is if I stop trying to grow along spiritual lines, I just start to suffocate spiritually. I start filling up with me. I start smothering myself with myself. And I have to grow. And growing is not always comfortable. I had a sponsee many years ago that had AIDS, and he eventually took him out. But he got 9 years. The doctor said he had 6 months to live, and he actually got over 9 years. And the first time after I sponsored him, he had a bout of pneumocystis pneumonia, and he was pretty sick. And back in those days, they didn't have the medications for AIDS they have today, and they didn't understand it. It was new, and even the doctors and nurses were somewhat afraid of it. And so they put him in the burn unit because they didn't know where else to put him, because it was the most sterile. It was the one. So they didn't have an AIDS ward. They put him in the burn unit, and so I'd go visit him in the burn unit, and one of the things I would notice walking through the burn unit is that they would bring people in, and you could almost not look at them. They'd be laying in a stretcher or on a gurney waiting to go into a room, and they were had horrible, horrible burns all over. I mean, they were in fires and stuff. It was terrible. It was frightening. But they were not in any pain. They were not in any pain because all the nerve endings had burned off. They just came from a fire, and they're not in any pain. You'd come back 2 days later and you would hear them screaming in agony down the hall. And the nurses would always say to them, I know it hurts, but that means you're getting better. Because they were. The body was replenishing and replacing the cells, and the nerves were growing back, and it hurts like hell. Hurts like hell. So I don't know. What are your, okay. When a sponsee is only using you as a sponsor in name, not going to meetings regularly, not taking suggestions, and not doing the work, are you better to let them go on for your own sake? No. Or as well as yours. I have to talk to a guy. I won't fire him necessarily. I used to fire guys and always felt bad about it, so now I let them fire themselves. But I will have a talk with a guy who's not doing it. I'll say, listen, I love you, but you're not sponsorable. You're not doing even the bare minimum of what it looks like to be sponsored. And I want you to know that if you drink again, or if you commit suicide or you get on drugs, I want you to know that you're not doing this thing so that you'll know that maybe this time you can come back and buy the whole package. Because I don't want you to be deluded that you're doing AA when you're not. I love you. I'm here for you. If you'll let me sponsor you, I'm here. I don't fire them. I put the ball. But if you want to consider me a sponsor, I mean, without feeling like a hypocrite, here's some minimal stuff. I mean, your sponsor should always know he's your sponsor. If you haven't called a guy for 2 months, he's not sure. I mean, right? I mean, you should have enough contact. You should be enough transparency with your sponsor that he feels like he's sponsoring you. And don't delude yourself. This is a program that demands rigorous honesty with yourself. Don't delude yourself. If you're not sponsorable, say to yourself, look, I got this. I don't need you. But don't try to imagine you're sponsorable and you have a sponsor when the truth is you don't. Do you hear that, Aaron? Okay. Oh, he's my scapegoat. Oh, Jesus. As per the chapter to the wives, do you think how, as a fellowship, do we deal with varying degrees of alcoholism? Oh, the 4 types. I don't think there makes a difference. I don't think that the severity of alcoholism is important. Is that important? We have people in AA that I've heard people share things in meetings that make me envious. Their bottom is better than my good days drinking. I mean, right. You came to AA because you lost your Learjet? Oh my God, you must suffer terribly. I mean, I've heard people say some bizarre stuff in AA, and yet, truthfully, I believe that they suffered internally the same way I did. So I don't judge that, the circumstances. Let's take a 5-minute break and we'll come back and do about another 40 minutes on step 12.